Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This is Part 12, Chapter 10, the second half. Todoroki did, in fact, agree to eat with them, and Izuku, Todoroki, Ida, and Uraraka sat at one of the tables in the waiting room. Most of the class had foregone the lunch that was provided for them and instead ate from bentos. Izuku sat next to Todoroki and across from Ida, while they all talked about the previous matches and how they thought the one-on-ones would go. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that it would be one-on-ones for the last part. It was how the sports festival always went. Izuku was just finishing up his lunch when his phone vibrated from within his pocket. He had retrieved it earlier to make sure he didn't have any messages from Yagi or Aizawa. Izuku set down his chopsticks and grabbed his phone, turning the screen around to face him. It lit up with the notification on his lock screen, and everything around Izuku fell away. May 7th, at 12:17. Good job so far, honey. I'm proud of you, Izuku. Izuku robotically set his phone face down on the table next to his bento, giving himself a second to see how his body was going to react. And yeah, that was definitely going to be a panic attack. He had to get away. Izuku stood, his chair's legs scraping against the floor. He grabbed his phone, slipping it back into his pocket. I'll be right back. He didn't know how his voice sounded, but it wasn't normal, because Todoroki frowned up at him. Ignoring it, Izuku turned, forcing himself not to sprint toward the door, and instead walked calmly. He turned to the left, searching for the nearest vacant waiting room. There was one close, and he woodenly walked towards it, reaching it and letting the door fall shut behind him. His back immediately hit the wall almost right next to the door, and he slid down, already gasping for breath, hands clenched over his chest. Todoroki was suddenly there, hands on his arms. Of course the boy had followed him. I knew something was wrong, Todoroki said. Izuku groaned, closing his eyes. He didn't like people seeing him like this. Todoroki was murmuring something, but Izuku couldn't hear him over the sound of his choked sobs. And then the boy was gone. Izuku pulled his knees as close as possible to his chest, his right hand scrabbling over his heart, while he fought to breathe, his mind whited out in panic and desperation to just breathe. Time always passed strangely during a panic attack, and it was at the point where Izuku was just waiting to pass out, when his teacher and current guardian arrived, dropping to his knees in front of him, and pulling him against his chest, while Todoroki stood nearby, rigid, unsure if he should stay. Breathe with me, problem child, Aizawa's deep, tired voice said, his arms wrapping around Izuku. Every breath hitched in Izuku's throat, and he just really couldn't do what Aizawa was asking, no matter how much he wanted to. Come on, Midoriya. The chest against his breathed obnoxiously deep, and Izuku sobbed, pressing his forehead against Aizawa's shoulder. It was so hard, and it hurt. This was by far one of the worst panic attacks he had ever had, and it had only been a text. Why did he... Izuku's breathing suddenly got worse, and sparks were appearing behind his closed eyelids. Whatever it is, don't think about it, Aizawa commanded, his hand rubbing against Izuku's shoulder blade. Just focus on getting through it. Breathe with me, Midoriya. Eventually, Izuku calmed down enough to wiggle out of Aizawa's grasp, pushing himself against the wall. He didn't want to be touched right now. Everything was too much. Todoroki and Aizawa were both watching him worriedly, and Izuku pulled his phone from his pocket, keeping his eyes closed as he turned it on and unlocked it from memory, thrusting it toward his guardian. He knew the same screen would still be there, his notifications open. Aizawa glanced down at the phone, only understanding a little bit. A message from his mom caused this strong of a reaction. He did think it was strange that she would text now and not when he had literally had an aneurysm. He looked back up at the hurting boy in front of him, when his hand stretched up to pull at his hair. Aizawa reached forward, gently grasping his wrist to pull them away from his head. It was just a text. I'm so weak, he moaned, and Aizawa's stomach twisted. Todoroki had crouched at Midoriya's side, seemingly unsure what to do. You're not weak at all, Midoriya, Aizawa said. In fact, I would say you're one of the strongest people here. You got first place in both matches so far. The boy shook his head, and Aizawa cursed himself. Of course that wouldn't help him. Izuku pointed to his head. I'm weak here. His voice was low, pained, desperate. Todoroki suddenly leaned forward. No, Midoriya. People like us, who've gone through the things that we have, are even stronger because of them. You're not weak. You're the strongest person I know. Aizawa frowned, glancing at Todoroki. People like us. Aizawa's eye twitched, and he made a note to check into the boy's home life. Izuku lifted his head, staring at Todoroki with his mouth open in surprise, eyes wide. He was suddenly lurching forward, wrapping his arms around Todoroki, who stiffened, pupils dilating. Aizawa watched in amusement as the boy hesitantly lifted his arms to awkwardly pat the boy on the back. Eventually, Midoriya rocked back into the wall, and Aizawa handed his phone back to him as he wiped at his eyes. Maybe you shouldn't participate in the finals. Midoriya lifted his head, flinching. After a second, he squared his shoulders. I'll be okay. I just need a minute. I can still participate. Aizawa looked at the boy doubtfully before sighing and standing up. Okay. Well, he glanced at the clock on the wall above them. You have 15 minutes until one-on-one start. I better get back to Mike. Make sure you let someone know if you need something, problem child. He turned his attention to the other boy. Thank you for getting me, Todoroki. Todoroki nodded to him, and then the erasure hero left the two of them alone. Izuku looked at the ground. I feel like I'm going to puke. I shouldn't have eaten anything. Todoroki leaned back. Should I retrieve a trash can? Izuku waved a hand. It's okay. He peered up at his friend. Thank you. You're a good friend, Peppermint. Todoroki blushed, looking away. After a moment, he cleared his throat. Are you sure you're going to be okay for the finals? Izuku smiled at him. You're not getting rid of me that easily. Todoroki frowned. I wasn't. Izuku chuckled. I'm kidding. He leaned against the wall, using it to help him pull himself up. His forehead wrinkled as he laid a hand against his head. Headache? Todoroki asked. Izuku sighed. Always. He straightened, letting off the wall. It's okay. I have Excedrin in my bag. Todoroki nodded, concerned, but letting Izuku lead the way back to where everyone had finished their food and were ambling about in bundles of nerves and excitement. Izuku went straight to his backpack, withdrawing a water bottle and his medicine. He tossed back 3 pills as well as something for his anxiety, and then swallowed it all in one go with a gulp of water. When he turned back around, half the class was watching him, but looked away when he caught them. He sighed, standing, his knees popping. He rejoined Ida and Uraraka, who were talking to Todoroki, who must have explained the situation to them because they pointedly ignored his reddened eyes. Apparently the girls were tricked into wearing cheerleading costumes. Izuku looked at Mineta and Kaminari in disgust. At least Hakakure seemed to be into it. The one-on-ones were announced after that, the lineup showing on the screen. Izuku looked at them curiously, noting that his first match was with someone named Shinso. Izuku looked around until he caught sight of the purple-haired person from General Studies watching him, the one that had declared war on them, who was trying to get into the heroics course. The boy's lips were in a thin line as he met Izuku's eyes and began walking toward him. Izuku took one step back. He was not in the mood to deal with someone's unwarranted anger against him. It's you, right, Izuku Midoriya? The spiky-haired boy asked, approaching him. Before he could answer, his mouth was obstructed with warm fur and flesh. Shinso smiled and walked away. Izuku ducked, and the tail fell away. He turned to face the boy who had kept him from speaking. What's wrong, Ojiro? He asked, frowning. Don't answer him, the boy said seriously, his eyes shifting to watch Shinso leave. Come with me. Izuku followed Ojiro to a waiting room where he explained everything he had experienced with the purple-haired boy. Izuku was left to contemplate what to do for his match. He felt bad for Shinso. He was such a bad pairing for the boy, especially since Ojiro had warned him about his quirk. He wouldn't get a chance to show what he could do if Izuku didn't answer, and he had seemed so desperate to get into the heroics class. Izuku walked down the tunnel, waiting for his name to be announced while he picked at his fingernails anxiously. His thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice shouting, "Hey!" in English. He turned around to find Yagi approaching him in his oversized suit. Sorry I'm late, but I wanted to see you before you started the one-on-ones. How are you feeling? Aizawa told me about what happened earlier. Izuku tapped his fingers together, sighing. After a moment, he shrugged. I'm tired and nervous, he answered. Yagi nodded, moving closer, steam billowing from him as he morphed into his muscle form, hands on his hips. Listen, it's times like this when you're scared or worried that you should deal with it by smiling. All Might tossed him a thumbs up. You've made it this far, young Izuku. He stepped closer to the boy, laying both his hands on his shoulders. No matter what happens from this point on, know that I'm very proud of you. Oh, fuck, this was so much better than a random text from the glorified stranger that was his mom. Izuku looked up at the man in awe, eyes wide and breath frozen in his chest. Tears came to his eyes, unsurprisingly, but he managed to keep them from falling. Yagi shrank down, still smiling at him, only now it was that familiar crooked grin of his powered-down form. The audience suddenly increased in volume, and Izuku glanced back. Yagi gave him a light shove. Get out there, my boy. Izuku gave him a nervous look before taking a deep breath and leaving the tunnel. Present Mike's voice greeted him as he stepped into the bright sun among the screaming crowd. Even though he's won both matches so far, what's with that face? Izuku's mouth quirked up. That was Mike's subtle way of telling him to buck up. He was doing great. Izuku could practically hear his voice telling him exactly that. From the hero course, Izuku Midoriya. Izuku walked forward, breathing in and out evenly, focusing on keeping his back straight and his chin up, ignoring the explosion of sound from the crowd at his name. Versus? Sorry, he hasn't done anything to stand out yet. From General Studies, it's Hitoshi Shinso. Izuku walked forward as Mike explained the rules of the game, approaching his opponent. The guy was intense and seemed like he was trying to present himself a certain way, like he was trying to seem confident and snarky, but he didn't know that Izuku could see his aura. The boy's aura was a bland gray, stripes of blackness slicing through it. Izuku had come to know pretty quickly what depression looked like after he developed this part of his quirk. He could see his own aura, after all, and Shinso's was painfully familiar. The two contestants stopped about a meter away from each other. I give up, huh? The boy said, and Izuku looked up with steel eyes, willing the adrenaline to come back and for the anxiety to go away like before. This is a fight to test the strength of your quirk. If you know what you want for your future, then you can't worry about appearances. Ready? Present Mike screamed. That monkey was going on about his pride. Oh, he was talking about Ojiro. Start! Mike yelled. But don't you think he was dumb for throwing away his chance? Shinso said, and Izuku knew what he was doing, trying to goad him into responding. But Izuku had years and years of experience of holding his tongue. This was nothing. Izuku began walking forward. The anxiety was slipping away, but it wasn't exactly adrenaline rising in him like before. It was anger. He walked forward, eyes burning like fire. You're lucky to have been blessed, Midoriya. The boy was stepping back, eyes widening. He reached Shinso, though, and threw a quirkless punch. Izuku was powerful, even without a quirk. After all his training and years of gymnastics, he was very in tune with his own body and strength, so he was unsurprised to feel Shinso's nose snap beneath his fist before he stumbled back. Driven by a burning anger, Izuku kept charging forward, all other sound drowned out. Shinso threw a punch, and Izuku dropped straight into a perfect split, and before he could stop himself, his fist was flying again, hitting the boy right in the balls. Shinso dropped like an anchor, vomiting. Izuku stood smoothly, grabbing the boy's arms and dragging him to the line, making sure he kept one finger up on his left hand. Izuku turned and bodily threw the boy across the line with only his own strength. There was silence. Izuku was announced the winner from a very sympathetic and stuttering Present Mike. Izuku stood over the boy, while they took a minute to recover. That was a low blow, Shinso grunted from the ground. Let's have a talk after all this is done, Shinso, he said, his arms crossed. Lay your trauma on me. This seems like the day for it. Shinso scowled. I don't. Shinso, I can see auras. Yours is not a happy yellow, I'll tell you that much. He shook his head and the boy's eyes widened. He turned to walk away, but immediately turned back around. He couldn't just leave it unsaid. He crouched next to the purple-haired boy. You shouldn't assume things about people. It can be very hurtful. And with that, He stood back up and stretched out his right hand, hoping that a friendly gesture would help the situation. At first, Izuku didn't think he would take it, but eventually he reached up and Izuku pulled him to his feet. They walked over together to stand in front of Cementos. "You're the one that yelled at Tetsu," Shinso said after a moment. "Who?" Izuku looked over at him. "The boy that you held up against the wall and screamed at for a good 5 minutes," Shinso explained flatly. "Ah." Izuku reached up to scratch the back of his head. "Yeah." Shinso hummed under his breath. "I'll get your phone number and message you later so we can have that talk." Izuku lifted his head, eyes wide. "Yeah?" Shinso nodded, and with that, he headed to the end of the platform, seeming surprised by the applause he received. "Even if it didn't work this time, I definitely won't give up. I'll get into the hero course, get certified, and I'll definitely become a better hero than you guys." "I'm excited for that day. Izuku's body went lax, and his vision tunneled. He couldn't move any part of his body, nor could he feel any part of his twisted mental state. It was amazing. "People are usually wary when they talk to me, though." Shinso seemed to laugh. Izuku was stuck, relishing in his mindscape. He couldn't necessarily see anything, but he could smell grass and feel the cool breeze. "At this rate, someone will trip you up in no time." The quirk released, and Izuku stumbled. The boy said something, but Izuku was already running after him. "Shinso, do it again! Do it again! Oh my gosh!" Shinso gave him the weirdest look. "You're a freaking weirdo," he said. Izuku nodded rapidly. There was no use trying to deny it. A few minutes later, Izuku joined his class in the stands. He sat down next to Ida, resisting the urge to lean into him. "I have to say, that was a strange move," Ida said, looking at him and gesturing about. Before he could answer, though, Ashido appeared next to him, leaning over Uraraka on his right. "Izuku, you can do a split?" she exclaimed. Izuku fluffed his own hair nervously, already missing the calmness of being under Shinso's control. "Yeah," he murmured. "I was in gymnastics for a long time. Well, I still am, but I haven't been able to go practice in a while. It really—" Ashido was suddenly gushing over the fact that he did gymnastics, but Izuku didn't understand why. He had joined when he was little because it was one of the only extracurricular activities in which quirks were completely banned. It was perfect for him, especially at the time when he thought he was quirkless. Before the rest of the class could catch what Ashido was excited about, the match had started. Izuku had known there was something wrong when he had seen the angry red aura swirling around Todoroki as soon as he walked out. It was a quick win by Todoroki against Zero, absolutely annihilating the poor boy. Izuku felt bad for him, and the crowd was left speechless. Izuku sighed as he watched the boy melt the ice with his left hand, the anger never dissipating, only adding more sadness to the mix. Izuku continued to watch the rest of the matches, unsurprised when Hatsume turned out to be only using Ida as a selling point. Izuku experienced a lot of second-hand cringe watching him. Izuku leaned back as Uraraka stood, walking away with her arms at her sides, her aura strangely dark. He frowned, watching her go. He considered it for a moment as Ashido and Aoyama's match began. Maybe she just needed some time alone. But in the end, he didn't feel right leaving her by herself with that aura of hers, so he stood up and went in the direction he had watched her leave. A few minutes later, and he found the room she was in, gently edging the door open. "Uraraka." She looked up at him from her spot at the table, brow furrowed. He frowned. Her aura was all over the place with anxiety. He moved to sit down next to her. "You're worried about your match with Kachan?" he asked. "Yeah," she answered softly. "He is definitely strong," Izuku said. "But so are you, Uraraka. Whether you win or not, you are amazing." "Thank you, Deku," she said, giving him a small smile. He stayed with her until her match. Ida joined later on, and Izuku watched as her aura slowly evened out a bit until she left for her match. Ida and Izuku returned to the stage to watch, Izuku nervously chewing on his already destroyed fingernails. The match went exactly how Izuku had internally predicted that it would. Kachan won, but Uraraka put up a really good fight. Izuku needed to tell her how absolutely amazing she was. Izuku stood up to go find her, but almost ran directly into Kachan on the way, and he froze up, backing into the wall without even noticing what he was doing. Kachan, hi, he said, his voice higher than it usually was. He swallowed thickly, angry at himself at the fear that he felt running through his veins. Why couldn't he make it stop? What the hell do you want? He yelled, and Izuku visibly flinched. Oh, well, Izuku frantically tried to think through the whiteout in his brain. He was already so anxious today. Random encounters with past bullies was not helping. I'm next, so I was going to go to the waiting room. Izuku turned. His body felt like wood. Congrats on winning your match. He took off, on a one-for-all powered run through the hallway as soon as he was out of view of the explosive blonde. He made it to player waiting room 2 and paused outside the door, hands on his knees. He really hated his brain and the way it worked. Kachan was just an old bully, but they were fine now, weren't they? Why couldn't he stop reacting like that when the boy was around? Izuku didn't have any hard feelings against him, did he? So why couldn't he just forget it all? Izuku found Uraraka in the waiting room with a forced smile on her face. She was immediately trying to come off as cheery and fine, but... Uraraka, I can see your aura, remember? She paused, lower lip beginning to tremble. Izuku's frown deepened and he approached her, allowing the door to shut behind him. He lifted his arms, spreading them slightly, inviting her into a hug but not trying to be awkward about it. She didn't hesitate, jumping up from her chair and practically leaping into his arms. She cried into his shoulder for a bit while he rubbed gentle circles on her back. He hummed quietly, completely unable to deal with the lack of noise besides the sounds of the girl sobbing in his arms. I thought I had him, she eventually said, her voice hoarse, leaning back to wipe her eyes. Izuku smiled at her, dropping his arms. You did so well, Uraraka. I don't think I would stand a chance against Kachan. She hesitated, glancing up at him, some emotion dancing in her eyes. Deku, if you beat Todoroki, you'll be fighting him in the finals. Izuku froze, mind racing, his heart skipping a beat. She was right. Kachan was definitely winning his next match, and there was no doubt about that. Kirishima was amazing, but... And if he defeated Peppermint... His hands went over his face and he groaned. Uraraka's hand fell on his shoulder. It's all right, he's not that scary, she tried to reassure him. You don't understand, he said with desperation, and that was when Mike's voice reached them, announcing the next round. Izuku straightened up, taking a deep breath. Oh, Uraraka exclaimed. I'm so sorry, you weren't able to prepare at all since I was here. It's all right. He lifted a hand to wave. I'm fine. He shook his head as he walked down the hallway, his shoulders tight. What was he going to do? Izuku felt the man approaching before he turned the corner, so he was able to square his shoulders down from around his head and force himself to look as confident as possible when Endeavor found him, his heat reaching Izuku even from the short distance between each other. He didn't say a word, only narrowing his eyes as the man turned and caught sight of him. Oh, there you are, his guttural voice said, eyes landing on him. Izuku shuddered under the stare. Every alarm bell in his body was going off now. The man reminded him so much of his father that he felt like he was either going to throw up or pass out. What do you want? Izuku ground out, upper lip twisting uncontrollably into a fierce grimace. I watched your fight, Endeavor said with narrowed eyes. They were intense and bright, similar to Todoroki's, but his had none of the friendly warmth to them, and none of the depth. You have a wonderful quirk. As if that was all that mattered in the pursuit of becoming a hero. Izuku's face twisted in disgust. He hated this man. He wanted to put him in his mindscape and then have a panic attack so that he could suffer in his fire. Izuku allowed himself to imagine that as the man continued to talk. You were able to place first in both rounds so far, and the power you've shown is very substantial. He pointed at Izuku. If we're talking about power alone, yours is comparable to All Might's. Izuku stiffened, his spine going ramrod straight. He didn't deign to give that particular line of thinking an answer. I need to go, he said, pushing past the man, ignoring the fact that he was so much bigger than him, so much like Hisashi. It is my Shoto's duty to surpass All Might, he said, and Izuku froze, facing away from him. His match with you will be a very instructive test. Don't disgrace yourself in it. Izuku could no longer remain calm. He whirled around to face the flame hero, all anxiety not fading away, but exploding away, red-hot anger overtaking him. "I will do whatever the fuck I want," he growled, hands formed into fists at his side. "I will disgrace the fuck out of myself if that's what I want to do, and you are in no place to tell me not to." Endeavor actually looked surprised, as Izuku practically blew up on him. Izuku was remembering his conversation with his friend earlier. He remembered the boy's pure hatred of his father, and how similar their situations were. He thought of his aura, the sadness and the pain he could see in it. Izuku had never wanted to eviscerate someone before this day. "That's all I wanted to say," Endeavor finished, and Izuku saw red. He took a step forward, and Endeavor visibly braced. Izuku stopped, forcing himself to calm down. "Fuck you, Endeavor," he said through gritted teeth. "I am not All Might, and Todoroki is not you. He's his own person with his own desires. You're a shit person for trying to force your own ambitions onto him." He lifted his head. "That's all I wanted to say." And he turned around, putting a whole new meaning into power walking. "Thanks for waiting, everybody. The first match of the second round is getting ready to start," President Mike was yelling. Izuku breathed out, fury still coursing through him. He could use it. Anger could be powerful. Izuku would help Todoroki and beat him. He had to piss that man off, and because Todoroki was his friend, he would help him as best as he could. They walked onto the stage, meeting each other in the middle. This was going to be a fight to remember. All right, listeners, this concludes the second half to Chapter 10. Chapter 11 will be up next. Let me know what you thought of everything so far. I think out of all the fics that I've read where Izuku stands up to Endeavor, I think that this one was probably one of my favorite altercations. So let me know what you thought to this one so far, and the fight with Shinso, because that took place as well. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.